They say the desert keeps its secrets because it knows how to starve the living. But in 1876, beneath the blistered sands of Arizona Territory, one secret refused to die, the kind that bleeds through time, staining every name that tried to bury it. It begins with a smell. The deputies wrote it down, the scent of boiled flesh rising from a pot too large for any rabbit, too thick for any stew. When they forced open the kitchen door of the Henley Ranch, they found plates still warm, a table half cleared, and a silence so heavy it felt rehearsed. They said Martha Henley was calm, that she didn't flinch when they asked what she'd cooked. She simply said, "Dinner." But this story isn't just about a murder. It's about hunger, the kind that doesn't start in the stomach. The kind that grows in silence, under the weight of control, until the mind breaks its own leash. For 12 years, Martha had been treated not as a wife but as an investment, a body measured by what it could produce. No children, no worth. No obedience, no peace. That's how control works, quietly, systemically. Not through chains but expectations. Through the illusion that suffering is your duty. Men built empires on that illusion, and women like Martha carried it like an inheritance of pain. Until one night, under the orange flicker of a kerosene lamp, something inside her stopped obeying. The sheriff's report never made the papers. It was buried under domestic matters. But in the deputy's private notes, hidden for over a century, were 9 words that turned a tragedy into legend. They didn't know, but they ate him. That single line would have destroyed reputations, bankrupted families, and shattered the fragile myth of moral frontier life. So it was erased, scrubbed from records, rewritten by men who feared what it meant that civilization itself could be cooked, served, and swallowed without ever realizing what it's eating. Because this isn't just a story about a wife who murdered her husband. It's about how control, once too tight, creates monsters. And sometimes those monsters don't come from the dark. They're born at the dinner table. By 1876, the Henley Ranch stood as a symbol of frontier success: broad fields, high fences, cattle branded with the proud H of a family name. But inside that house, the air itself was thick with hierarchy. Samuel Henley didn't run a home. He ran an economy of submission. Every gesture, every word, every silence from Martha had value or cost. That's how control evolves. First it demands work. Then it demands identity. Then it takes belief. She rose before the sun not because she wanted to, but because the system required her to believe that obedience was survival. And that belief, repeated day after day, becomes ritual. Not so different from religion, really. The church, the state, the husband, all built on one principle. Convince the servant that service is divine. In the dusty corners of the Henley Ranch, Martha prayed, but not to any god that watched over men. She prayed to absence, to something wordless, shapeless, maybe even listening. When Samuel beat her, she didn't scream anymore. She learned that silence was power disguised as surrender. That's when she began changing. It always begins like that, quietly. The neighbors whispered that she'd started speaking less, but writing more. Tiny words carved into the wooden table when she thought no one was looking. Symbols of circles, spirals, and crossed lines. Primitive, yes, but every culture has its sigils for breaking control. The church calls them blasphemy. Psychologists call them dissociation. But they all point to the same truth. The mind will find freedom, even if the body cannot. That's what no one ever understood about Martha Henley. She wasn't insane. She was awakening. And in awakening, she realized something every oppressed soul eventually learns. The system doesn't fear rebellion. It fears comprehension. Because once you understand why you're controlled, obedience dies on its own. So when Samuel came home that final night, drunk, bitter, and godless, Martha wasn't just a wife anymore. She was an equation reaching completion. She'd stopped believing the lie. And once a lie dies, something darker always takes its place. The night of October 3rd began like 100 others, dust settling over the desert, cicadas screaming into silence, the smell of whiskey on the wind. But something in the air was different. You can always feel it before the breaking, when a pattern, worn too thin, finally tears. Martha felt it first. a quietness inside her that wasn't peace, but clarity. The kind that comes when fear burns itself out. Samuel came home late. He slammed the door like a man entering a courtroom. Every sound a declaration of power. The lamp flickered in the kitchen. Martha didn't look up. She was washing a plate that was already clean. Control, habit, survival all tangled in that one motion. He called her name. Once, twice. Each word heavier than the last, soaked in the authority he believed still belonged to him. She answered softly, the way she always did. But something in her tone made him stop. It wasn't submission. It was absence. The kind of calm that makes predators uneasy. He shouted again, stepped closer. That's when he saw the knife on the counter, the butcher's knife. Blade glinting like a sermon of consequence. And maybe, just for a second, he realized that even a quiet woman can be the most dangerous thing God ever made. He raised his hand, his ritual gesture of dominance, but the pattern had already broken. Martha didn't flinch this time. She moved. Quick, precise, almost surgical. The sound that followed was not rage. It was release. 12 years of silence, crystallized into a single red truth. They say the body can hold memories. If that's true, then Samuel's must have remembered every insult, every blow, every night she prayed for escape. And as his blood hit the floorboards, the desert outside seemed to inhale as if the earth itself had been waiting for this correction. Martha didn't cry, didn't tremble, didn't pray. She simply began cleaning again. The same motion as before, but this time, she was washing something real away. Because in her mind, the sin wasn't murder. The sin was ever believing she was powerless. And that's when the hunger began. Not for food, but for completion. When dawn came, the desert was mercifully quiet. No gunfire. No gossip. No God. Just wind against the shutters and the smell of iron thickening in the air. Martha moved through the house like a ghost fulfilling its duty. Her hands did not shake. Her breath stayed measured. She was efficient the way only the broken and reborn ever are. She dragged Samuel's body to the kitchen floor. The dirt beneath the boards had drunk enough tears to know what was coming. She didn't think in words, only in tasks. Knife, saw, boil. To a bystander, it might have looked like madness. To her, it was purification. There are old texts, Roman, Mesopotamian, older still, that describe rituals of transformation through consumption. Take and eat, for this is mine. The act of devouring as reclamation of power. Civilization hid those rites beneath scripture, called them metaphor. But every metaphor begins as a memory. When the brothers arrived later that morning, Martha had already prepared the meal. She smiled faintly, as though nothing had happened. She said Samuel had ridden out early, chasing a debt. They believed her. Why wouldn't they? In a world built on denial, truth sounds insane. The stew was thick, rich, savory, unfamiliar. The men ate in silence, complimenting her skill. Rebecca and Catherine joined in, relieved to taste something that didn't taste of despair. Martha served them all, one spoonful at a time. The scent filled the room, warm and human. She didn't eat. She only watched. It wasn't vengeance she felt. It was transcendence, that strange moment when the slave becomes the author of their story. Every system of power throughout history has relied on one sacred lie, that the victim must never see themselves as the architect. But in that kitchen, surrounded by her captors unknowingly consuming the man who'd ruled them all, Martha inverted the ritual. The master's flesh became sustenance for the obedient. And in that moment she was free. Freedom doesn't always come in light. Sometimes it comes in silence, disguised as dinner. Sometimes it comes in blood, disguised as grace. Now, if you've made it this far, prove that you understand. Comment below twice the phrase, "I consume the lie," because that's what this is really about. Not murder, not myth, but digestion of everything that ever controlled you. The sheriff arrived 10 days later, led by the stench that had finally overpowered the lies. By then, the Henley ranch had gone, still no riders, no laughter, no smoke from the chimney, just emptiness, as if the desert itself had swallowed every witness. They found the remains buried beneath the root cellar, half consumed by lime and denial. Bones boiled clean. Joints severed with precision. The deputy's notes described it clinically: evidence of dismemberment, portions missing, likely disposed through cooking. But his handwriting faltered halfway through the sentence, as though he understood he was writing something too heavy for paper. When they questioned Martha, she didn't deny it. She didn't defend herself either. She simply said, "He fed us his whole life. I just made sure it was true." They called it madness. But madness is a convenient word for anything that dismantles the hierarchy. The sheriff wanted a confession that fit the moral order. He needed her to be evil, not logical. Because if she was logical, if what she did made sense in the structure of her oppression, then the entire system cracked. And civilization, even in its infancy, cannot afford self-awareness. So the reports were sanitized. The trial never recorded. The files labeled domestic incident. Because to admit that a woman might reach such deliberate power to feed patriarchy to itself was unthinkable. The desert buries its sins under dust. The state buries them under paperwork. But here's the part they never wrote down. One deputy resigned the following week. He left Arizona entirely, joined a monastery in Santa Fe, and was later found writing in the margins of his prayer book. She didn't kill him. She released something. That line erased, rewritten, forgotten might be the truest sentence ever written about Martha Henley. Because when you break a system built on fear, the fragments don't vanish. They scatter, seeking new hosts. And every generation since has eaten pieces of that silence in obedience, in shame, in pretending not to know where the bones are buried. The Henley case wasn't just suppressed. It was absorbed. Like everything dangerous to power, it became part of the meal. Power doesn't destroy its enemies, it digests them. That's the rule no one teaches in school. Every empire, every church, every nation built on control has learned this. If you can't kill the truth, rewrite it. If you can't erase the act, ritualize the silence around it. The Henley case should have been legend. Instead, it was reduced to gossip, then rumor, then nothing. Because institutions don't fear murder, they fear meaning. The notion that suffering can create wisdom is the greatest heresy in human history. So they buried Martha Henley under layers of fiction. Insanity, possession, grief. Words designed not to describe her, but to contain her. That's how suppression works. The system doesn't just hide what happened, it makes you forget that forgetting was ever required. History becomes a menu, curated by the victors, served to the obedient. You and I are still eating from that table. Think about it: every textbook, every official record, every neatly packaged moral tale you were fed growing up. Each one seasoned with the same lie: that evil is an exception, not a function. But what if Martha's act wasn't an eruption of darkness, but a mirror, a reflection of what happens when a society feeds on obedience and calls it order? After the ranch was abandoned, the land passed to a cattle syndicate backed by territorial banks. Those same banks funded the railroads that connected Phoenix to the wider world. And in the paperwork, under previous owner, one name appears again and again: Henley Holdings. Her family's wealth, cleaned, laundered, reincorporated. The flesh of the oppressed reborn as profit. You think that's a coincidence? Control never dies. It adapts. It changes costume, vocabulary, shape. The same energies that silenced Martha Henley now wear suits, draft policies, run networks, teach conformity as virtue. They don't need chains anymore, they have culture. And that's why this story matters. Not because it's old, but because it's ongoing. The machinery that consumed her is still feeding on your time, your focus, your silence. Every headline you forget, every truth you scroll past, every instinct you smother to stay acceptable, that's part of the feast. And the question is, how much of you is left unconsumed? Control didn't end when they buried Martha Henley. It evolved. It learned from its mistakes, learned that brutality draws attention, but comfort creates compliance. The chains were replaced with screens. The whip became a feed. And the kitchen where obedience once simmered became the algorithm where attention now burns. Look around you. What was once the ranch is now the network. Same structure, new language. There's a Samuel Henley in every corporation, every government, every voice that tells you what to fear, what to want, who to be. They no longer need to strike you, they only need to distract you. Because the distracted man never revolts, he scrolls. That's the genius of the modern system. It makes you believe you're free while you curate your own cage. Your thoughts, your opinions, your outrage harvested, repackaged, and sold back to you. It's the same feast that began in that kitchen in 1876. You just don't taste the iron anymore. And the irony? You feed it willingly. You give your time, your energy, your attention, your most sacred currency to a structure that thrives on your exhaustion. When you stop thinking, it grows. When you feel powerless, it strengthens. When you conform, it celebrates. Martha's story isn't about madness. It's about inversion. When she fed them their own corruption, she exposed a pattern humanity still can't face. That the oppressed and the oppressor are bound by the same appetite for control. And the only way to escape it is to stop feeding it. You are surrounded by invisible ranches, workplaces that drain you, news that poisons you, platforms that praise your compliance and punish your clarity. And every day you obey, you become a little more digestible. But here's the paradox. The moment you see the machinery, it stops working. Because control only functions when it hides behind normalcy. Once you see the pattern, you can no longer eat from that table. So look at your own life, at what you're consuming and what's consuming you. Ask yourself, are you eating the truth, or is the truth eating you? If you've made it this far, something inside you already shifted. You've felt it, that vibration under the skin when the mask of reality starts to crack. That's not fear. That's recognition. The same recognition that once stared through Martha Henley's eyes as she cleaned the blood from her hands and finally understood. It was never about the act. It was about ownership. Who owns your mind? Who writes your story? Who decides what is remembered and what gets buried beneath normal? They buried her name under silence because silence is the first tomb every rebel meets. But silence isn't empty. It echoes. And tonight you heard it. We live in an age where control is invisible, woven into convenience, comfort, and distraction. You are told what to think is important. You are told what to fear. You are told that your worth is measured in productivity, obedience, relatability. But beneath all that noise is a quieter truth. You are not meant to consume what they serve. You are meant to remember what you are. The systems of power, governments, corporations, even faith itself, all rely on your participation in the illusion. They need your guilt to feed their virtue. They need your exhaustion to prove their authority. But the moment you stop believing the menu, you starve the beast. You stop being the meal. You become the fire. That's what Martha became, not a monster, not a martyr, but a mirror. She reflected the sickness that fed her, then burned it from within. And that's what this story has always been, a coded ritual of awakening disguised as horror. A mirror for every man who has ever felt small, cornered, voiceless, yet still carrying the potential to devour his chains. So, if you understand now, leave your mark. Comment below twice the phrase, "I consume the lie," not as obedience to an algorithm, but as rebellion against it. A digital sigil carved in open air, proof that you see. Remember, the world doesn't end in fire or flood. It ends in forgetfulness. And tonight you remembered. The desert keeps its secrets, but it never forgets who finally learned to listen. If you feel the system watching you right now, you're right. Comment "I consume the lie" twice below to prove you see it. And subscribe before they make this story disappear again.